There's the sound. Aha.
We're hearing you.
Ooh. There we go.
That's more like it. Can you guys hear me, David and Leslie?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Or on air, yes.
We can hear you.
Good, now we can hear you too.
Okay.
Okay.
We're just putting our dishes away. 1 second.
Take your time. We'll watch a Monday night or Thursday night free football game. Yeah. I was just,
Oh, there's David and Leslie. Hi, David.
Let me help the camera. That was Carol from back here. There we go.
Is the owl looking at me? Hi, Leslie.
All right.
Who else is?
Just David and
Anybody
Leslie and
else?
us. There's another gentleman named Josh.
Is he the guy that was on the first one?
Yes. Yes,
He's
exactly.
kind of new to the picture.
He is new, yeah. That was his first time here.
Oh, I just had a great business and.
I don't know who the
Yeah.
hell
I
he
had it
is.
in I just got 3 new ones. I had it all.
Oh, standing up.
Yeah, I'll worry about it tomorrow. Yeah, they were. Somebody called.
That's Dave. That's Dave. Their daughter was doing the truck, the journey program down California. Is she home now?
She is. And Fred,
Yes.
you could probably approach her.
Oh, good.
She did a phenomenal, it was about a half hour, but she did a phenomenal presentation for my sorority group with slides and facts and. So anyway.
Is that the pilgrimage thing she did?
You could say that, right? Yeah. It's more
Well,
like a
she
life
wanted to
adventure,
do
right?
it because of COVID, and she didn't like her job, and she was, if I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna do it now. She thought she might get clarity, she said she got nothing, but she enjoyed the trip and it was worth it.
You know, I feel bad for kids. My son,
she
he's
did a
coming
job.
next week. He came with me now.
Right.
So he'll be here for Thanksgiving. I mean, I feel bad. I feel like they feel lost. You know, he's
So
like,
she
I don't
needs
want
to
to
get
get, I
away
don't
and
want to
get
get
paid
married. I want
to
to
get
get
benefits.
Why? If the world is falling apart.
So she's working for.
It's hard when it's
I
an
don't like their
existential.
advice, and I feel like what can I do to help them?
Yeah.
You know?
She's gonna start working every month.
Anyway, so I'm sure he'll come to church with me. He likes this church. He said, Mom, I like your church. It's real friendly, so.
Good. He caught us on a good day.
I have not had a bad day yet.
Oh, just you wait. No.
No, we all have bad days.
And you've been here through what I think is
Not the most interesting half of the year is the summer.
Everything's got to be more interesting than zooming mass in on the Catholic channel on TV. Because they're very. My brother said, "Why are you watching that channel? They're very conservative Catholics. They're broadcast out of Birmingham, Alabama." Yes, EWSN, Eternal Word Network.
Yeah.
Go this way.
Oh, he is. Oh. So are you in there?
Does anybody want a piece of quiche to take home? You are.
No, you know what? I know, you know,
See, I will,
this is so much better. Silver Cross Hospital. And when I went in there.
Sorry, David, Leslie, we're just still cleaning up from dinner. Sorry.
That's
Take your
fine.
time.
Hope you had a good one.
It was quiche. It was very good.
Yummy.
And watermelon salad, cheesy potatoes. Yeah, very Midwestern. Very good.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not done. No, I don't want to. No. Yeah.
I have an extra plastic bag.
What is it? So it's like an external camera and speaker in one. I think Owl is the company, and it's actually called Meeting Pro, I think. It's $995, $900, $995, not $900. But I think it's a game changer because this up here is if it's not 360, it's like 270-degree camera, and it follows the speaker in the room like me. And if it detects multiple sounds like this, you see it kind of divide the screen. Yeah, I've seen it do it in birds too. And then for the people at home, and I think David and Leslie can attest, the sound quality is as good as it can be, probably. You know, you can hear people, and it's not, you know, it's like, it's not seamless, but it's the best you can do with Zoom, I think. Yeah. And I was sitting in meetings at the diocese with this before COVID, and they were using this, and they were like, this experimental device. Yeah, exactly.
It's a game changer for like Bible studies and this, yeah, it really makes a difference for people that are Zoom. Yeah.
Exactly. When you're going to be integrating things, it makes a big difference.
No.
All right. Well, sensing a slowdown in the kitchen, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming back after a week off. And what we're going to do again is this week on, next week on, and then it's Thanksgiving. Can't believe it. And then we come back and we do 2 more of these, okay?
Sure.
So I will come back and ask again, but be thinking if you feel called to host dinner again, because I think all the volunteers have done it. And if not, we can, oh, did I already see a hand? Yes,
host
Carol.
dinner.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, now you've seen the expectations, right? No, it's okay.
Yeah, I know.
No,
Don't get too
we'll-
excited
we
when you
are-
volunteer.
We are an easy crowd.
What do I do next week?
Oh, gotta click the right thing. Next week, if you want. Yes, there you go. This will be in
Make him
town.
come with me.
All right, well, let me kind of orient you a little bit. Like you've heard me say, I kind of, even though we do this every 3 years, we do this, I mean, it's only the second time we've done this. But I have taught a variation on this class about 3 times before, and I can't help myself to change it because I get bored with myself. But I also, I just want a little bit of like just kind of thinking, kind of feeling where discussions are going and maybe some things that might be helpful for you also. Bear with me a little bit, but I wanted to try to take a slightly different approach and also not spend so much time recapping. So we did, I will say week 1 was about God, week 2 was about the Old Testament, and now we're going to talk about Jesus. And it is kind of helpful to think for your head. It's kind of nice we've got these like 2 classes together with like gaps on either side, because these 2 weeks will be about Jesus in some way, one way, shape, form, or another. More about the New Testament next week, and about writings and interpretation about Jesus. But tonight I thought I would just kind of simplify things a little bit and talk about kind of the two approaches to understanding or appreciating who Jesus of Nazareth was. What you're looking at on the screen is a place in Jerusalem. I may have taken this photo. Can't remember. This is called the Garden Tomb. This is a place, some of you may have heard me talk about it before. It's outside the city walls of Jerusalem, the old city. Jerusalem's a modern city surrounding an old city in the center. And it was excavated in the first found only in the 19th century by a group of, wait for it, Anglican priests who were there on a pilgrimage. And so they
found it?
They found it, yes. It was an uncovered, it was like a park that was just kind of had bush and stuff all over it. And they started digging, and the reason that caught their attention was it's unusually hilly for modern Jerusalem, which itself is kind of a big, broad, there's a lot of hills and mountains, but for where it is, which is about maybe a quarter-mile walk from the old city of Jerusalem, where, by the way, exists, and I didn't have a picture of it, probably the site that you're most familiar with, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is in the old city, which is the place where the church has historically said this is where Jesus was crucified, and within a few steps within the same church building, the place where he was laid to rest. So then you have this place outside, and one of these Anglican priests noticed that the rock formation naturally, this is all natural, had this kind of shape to it. It looked like eyes and a nose, and said, you know, it looks a little bit like a skull. And if you have been in this church before or any other church, you may have heard the Palm Sunday or even the Good Friday lesson where they say Jesus is taken to Golgotha, which in Hebrew is the same, and also in a more English Latin word, we say Calvary. But Golgotha is the place of the skull. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the more traditional one, is on top of what would have been what they say it was. So you can get into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and you can reach down and touch some rock, but it's layers and layers beneath the church because it's all these empires taking over Jerusalem in 2,000 years, building on top of it. And then you get to this garden tomb, which is fairly new. Now, I was just there 2 summers ago, and it was already 3 times the amount of people I had seen since I'd been there before. So the word is out that this could be a more accurate location of where Jesus was laid to rest. Yes, Carol?
So wasn't this tomb though, wasn't it Joseph of Arimathea's tomb?
Yes, exactly.
Didn't he
According
use
to
it?
tradition.
Didn't he use it after Jesus
No, he
rose from the dead?
No, he gave it to Jesus and out of respect, you
So
know,
once Jesus rose from the dead, he's
Yeah, he
like,
retired.
"Ooh, I don't want to."
pretty much, yeah. And you can't see it here, but kind of on the grounds, there are these places where tombs where people would have been laid to rest. So you can go into the tombs and stand in there and all. They give tours now.
So wouldn't they kind of know, wouldn't they have known where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was? I mean, why is it lost?
It's not that it was lost, it's that it's been built upon.
Uh,
So when you are in the early church, I'm talking about the first 1,000 years into the Middle Ages, when you want to, what's the opposite of desecrate? Because I almost said desecrate. When you want to consecrate a place that you believe is a sacred place, you build a church on top, right? But then what happens when the Ottoman Empire comes in and desecrates your church? In that case, you do desecrate, right? And then what happens when you claim the land back, but then you're sharing it with Jews and Muslims, and so layers upon layers, 2,000 years of which. Now, the reason I point all this out is that this is, to me, this is the plight of being Christians in the 21st century, which is we carry a tradition of what we know and we're raised about Jesus, and it's sometimes in conflict with what might historically have been true. And while this is cool, and someone like me, I would get really excited about this, you can see how this can be problematic for people that have built their life and their civilizations on the fact that it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus was laid to rest. So how do you balance the tradition with what may or may not have been historic? So the way I'm kind of gonna talk about this tonight is think of it as two separate Jesuses, Jesus. We have the Jesus of our tradition and the Jesus of history. So who is Jesus? This is, I talk about this a lot, but this is one of my favorite portrayals of Jesus. And this is our classic image of Jesus, which is as white can be, with blue eyes and an English accent and the long straight hair, right? But before we do that, and this goes for David and Leslie at home as well, I want you, before I say anything further, I want you to tell me when I say the name Jesus or Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Christ, give me some words or phrases that just come to mind.
Shepherd.
Shepherd.
My kids did catechesis.
The catechesis. Yeah. I'm gonna hear a lot of Catholic responses. What else about Jesus?
The word.
The word. Thank you.
I want to say peasant.
Peasant.
Teacher.
This is great because I'm gonna try to make sure I hit on these words in the rest of the next 30 minutes.
Courageous.
Courageous.
Teacher.
We have teacher, but I'm gonna do one of these where you like.
Questioner.
You say questioner? All right. Chloe, what does Jesus come? What does that make you think of when I say Jesus?
God.
Okay.
Sorry, it was my daughter's birthday, and the time change, I had to wait till she got off work.
That's fine. Anything else?
He's adopted.
Adopted and
I was gonna say challenger, not, I can't
Yep.
say the exact word it was, but he was always kind of along with Mike in terms of rebel, but he was always like in your, in the face, pushing you.
Yeah.
How about charismatic?
yeah. Let's say pushing others. Charismatic. Yes. I know this is like rudimentary facilitation. but
Demanding.
I love this stuff. Demanding. I just love to hear what other people think.
Accepting.
David and Leslie, if you've got more, just jump right in too.
I was just gonna say God in human flesh.
Yeah, can I say incarnate?
That's yes, that would be a one word statement of what I was saying.
It's so priestly, isn't it? The incarnate word of God. I think this is good. Anything missing, you don't think? So let me read them again, because I don't, especially for David and Leslie's sake. You've got shepherd, adopted, God incarnate, challenger, the word, peasant, charismatic, accepting, teacher, rebel, courageous, demanding, questioner, pushing others, son of God,
Inclusive.
inclusive.
He embraced everyone.
That's right.
Role model.
That's what I was thinking.
Role model,
Healer.
now we're cooking. Healer. Great. All right, these are excellent. We could go on for days, probably. So like I said, I'm gonna basically do it this way. And before I used to kind of alternate through. So we're gonna talk about the classical account of Jesus and the historical Jesus tonight. Let's talk about the classical account of Jesus. Where do you think of the words that we said, what are some of the things that would be kind of filed under the classical account of Jesus? So when I say classical, let me do this example. since somebody named it, for those that were raised Catholic, we're talking about the things you would have been learning in catechesis.
Oh, that's shepherd.
So shepherd,
Shepherd,
yeah,
yeah.
shepherd,
Son of
word,
God.
son of God,
Teacher.
teacher, right?
God incarnate,
Exactly,
the word.
the word, right? Fascinating. The major moments in his life, you could probably do this better and quicker than I could. Well, we've got, of course, the virgin birth. Mary is visited by an angel and gives birth to a child in Bethlehem, the city of David. And then everybody starts singing Handel's Messiah, right? It's coming right around the corner. And then Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan River. This is just kind of the greatest hits of Jesus' life here.
What about when he was 12?
I know, I'm saying greatest hits of Jesus' life.
All right.
Yeah, although that's a good story. He begins his teaching and his healing ministry at about 30 years old. He performs miracles. So we got healer on here. Of course, the crucifixion, an innocent man misunderstood, executed by the Jews and the Romans. And I'm trying to put this line in too, this is important, that much of what's happening in Jesus's life, according to tradition, is to fulfill the Hebrew scriptures, the stuff we talked about 2 weeks ago. And that's like the words like scourging. A lot of this prophesied in Isaiah particularly. So we're going to hear from Isaiah in Advent as Isaiah prepares us for the arrival of the Christ child. It's impossible that Isaiah knew about Jesus of Nazareth 300 years before he showed up. But nevertheless, once you have a Christian community for at least a century or more, worshiping this person as the Son of God, then you look back on the Hebrew scriptures and you go, wow, it sure sounds like Isaiah knew Jesus was coming, or at least it resonates and it kind of echoes. Back to Jesus's life. 3 days after his death, he returns from the dead, and it's proof of God's victory over death and sin. And he ascends to heaven. We switched our Eucharistic prayers on Sunday. For some of you, especially at 8 o'clock, that was a very welcome relief. And the Eucharistic prayer is all the stuff around communion. And the one we're doing now for this month is prayer A. And prayer A spells out remembering his death, resurrection, and ascension. We offer you these gifts. And I always like that it remembers the ascension too, because that's kind of that day in the church calendar kind of gets lost a little bit. It's always in May or June, right between 40 days after Easter. It's on Thursday. He ascends to heaven, and once he gets there, he, as we know from our creed, sits at God's right hand. However, that's probably been painted more than it is probably actually lived out. He's understood to return at the end of the world or the end times, and somehow we will be reunited with him, with God, and live forever as he does. Some of this terminology would be familiar to you. And this might not be one that you think about too much, but it's certainly a part of the tradition that Jesus is an intercessor, which is actually a word we use for those that read the prayers on Sunday in church. That means one doing prayers on behalf of others. So you can pray to Jesus, kind of like good Catholics pray to the saints or pray to Mary to do some work on their behalf. And then Jesus becomes the object of our prayers, because a lot of us pray to Jesus, which you can absolutely do. Shoot, you can pray to anybody as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if you're gonna get results from everybody, but you'll see. So we're talking to, remember the first week, theology, the belief in God, the study of God. So a theological question about Jesus is gonna wonder, what is Jesus's relationship to the big picture with God? Does that make sense? There is actually a fancy word called Christological, which is all about belief about Jesus as Christ, as a Savior. But it's too much for right now. So theological Jesus means, how does Jesus fit into the grand picture of God, the ultimate reality we were talking about 3 weeks ago? So God is incarnate, as David was pointing out. He is God in the flesh. The Word made flesh, and that's the phrase in English from John's Gospel. And Jesus is the Son of God. Bingo. I guess I should check these off when we do them. So there is a father-son relationship that is throughout the Gospels and the New Testament, that Jesus refers to God as Father, and there are times where God speaks and refers to Jesus as Son or Beloved. And then there's this term Son of Man, which comes up a lot. And I really think when it does in readings, the onus is on the preacher to explain what that means, because we hear it a lot. It doesn't quite make sense. It almost sounds like they put in the wrong word. Did you mean son of God? What is son of man? Well, son of mankind is this Old Testament term. It comes from the book of Daniel. Spoiler alert, we're going to hear briefly from Daniel this coming Sunday. And it's about judgments. It's so this idea in the grand scheme of things is that Jesus does some kind of judging on behalf of God. So Jesus is like a judge, like that trial going on in Kenosha with the judge who is a bit of a character, right? Jesus is a bit of a character as well and has this authority from God to do judgment, to decide who goes to heaven and hell. Remember, right now I'm just talking about the tradition of what we've been told to believe, not necessarily whether it's right or wrong. And then, of course, this other component that he's the second coming, the Savior. And I put this note in here that we really still grapple with this. There are other traditions. Some of us have been in those traditions before, where they have a very specific understanding of what second coming means. It means the earth is going to come to an end apocalyptically with fire and brimstone, and Jesus is going to descend, or we're going to get raptured up. You know, you've heard all of these stories. And that's how the second coming is going to be. A bit like that painting there where everyone is going crazy and angels are down there and all that. It's a little bit of a resurrection story, but you can see how in that painting, I'm sorry, Jesus's head is cut off. Sorry, Jesus. That this painting is about the resurrection, but it is influenced by that kind of thinking or that kind of understanding about Jesus, that he is triumphant, victorious. Of course, he's still white and in incredibly great shape. Yeah, got a good belly button, and there, you know, and everybody's afraid, and the angels are pointing to him, and he's the judge. This is the Son of Man.
He's not in a suit, that's for sure.
He's not in a suit. Yes, exactly. In the Episcopal Church, our understanding is usually again found in how we worship, in addition to things like teaching or sermons. And when we get to, as we are doing in this Eucharistic prayer this month, so now the secret's out that I did this Eucharistic prayer for your sake, not for the rest of the church's sake. You're wondering how we come up with these things. When we get to the part in the middle of Eucharistic prayer where there becomes a dialogue between the priest and the congregation, we say, therefore, wait a minute, do this in the Lord's Prayer. Therefore, according to his command, O Father, and then we remember his death in prayer B, or Christ has died, Christ is risen. And, you know, for our purposes, let's understand that Christ has risen because that happened in our past. But you can kind of see the little dance that the English is doing in our prayer book about this rising kind of constantly happens, that Jesus is always resurrecting. We're being resurrected in little ways and in big ways, and that Christ will come again. But we never really, in the Episcopal Church, get into the details of what does that come again look like? Did we come to Jesus? Does he come to us? You know, is it more metaphorical? All of those things. We won't be able to tackle that tonight, but maybe you will in your small groups. There is also the understanding of Jesus through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, because once you have this tradition of Jesus as the Son of God, Son of Man, the second coming, the Savior, and then you compare it with everything in the Old Testament that's prophesied, you come up with some of these solutions, that some of these themes will apply, that Jesus is some kind of high priest. Our readings in Hebrews this whole season, it's the second lesson, it's from the Epistle of Hebrews. There's a lot of talking there about the high priest, and it pops up sometimes in our language, but not always. So it's one of the fun things about having the lectionary to kind of give you little samples, like you're having a tapas meal or something, little samples of different theologies about Jesus. So one says he's a priest. Others will think of him as a king. The Romans put the sign over his head, King of Jews. We have no reason to dispute that they didn't do that, because that's actually what they did in the first century. They would sometimes they would kill them first and then crucify them. And then they would always put what the sentence was of why they were executed as a deterrent. You did not want insurrectionists constantly threatening the crown, for lack of a better word, back in Rome. So you crucified them to make an example of them, and you made it in a really public space so that everyone could see the horror of what happens when you go against the emperor, right?
So I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Does the king,
is that one reason why they make this huge effort to explain how he's related to David?
Yes, that's definitely it,
Like,
because
he is royal, so here's
that,
how.
yeah, 100%.
Okay.
David was the great king of Israel. We didn't have much time to talk about that 2 weeks ago, but the great king. So therefore, in your mind, if the Messiah, the Son of God, which is these other two, if the Messiah, the Savior, is coming back, the one we've put all our hopes in, then he's clearly going to be like David. He's going to be a warrior. He's going to be king. He's going to be wise and make great decisions and all that. But they think of him in terms of a king, and that becomes a threat to Rome, right? So now I'm kind of veering into the actual history here. Jesus is sometimes understood as a prophet, and truly other faiths like Islam treat him as a prophet. And then Messiah, which is a distinctly Jewish term, which means the Savior. In Greek, it comes out Christos, which is where we get Christ from. And Messiah and Christos both mean anointed one, so that God has somehow set them apart for a special kind of ministry, for lack of a better word, or mission. So in summation, there's Robert Powell again. The theological Jesus shows us what God is like. So, often you are, and these are, please know I'm not criticizing or saying this is all what I truly believe or what you should believe, but this is what is kind of doctrinal. This is part of the belief system of the church. That Jesus shows us what God is like. You want to know what God is like? You look to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. You look to Jesus' teachings. You look to the miracles. You look to the sacrifices he makes. So it's teaching, and then ultimately on the cross, it's an example of self-giving love. That the term is sometimes called agape, unconditional. In other words, the kind of love like a parent to a child, that you'll do anything for the child. So that's Jesus to humanity. Upends the law and the patriarchy. So he's facing a tradition and Roman rule that he is going right in the face of. So that's where we get, some of you said challenger and rebel. We're gonna say more about that in a second. Demanding, pushing others, questioning all their tradition. He openly embraces the least. That means the last, the poor, women, everybody that's been marginalized. That's who Jesus tends to gravitate towards. And God's grace is freely given. So in other words, Jesus's huge message is that certainly clear through much of the New Testament, although it gets kind of pushed back in some of the letters, the epistles, is that you don't do anything to earn it. You don't inherit. You literally just receive, blessings, good life, whatever it is from God. And yes, maybe even punishment. That's certainly a part of Jesus we've received from tradition, punishment and judgment, right? But that there's always an opportunity for forgiveness. Probably one of my favorite New Testament stories or gospel stories is only found in Luke. And it's one of those things that just passes that Jesus litmus test where you go, that is so Jesus. Well, whoever Jesus is for you, we can all agree that that's so Jesus, like that show, that's so Raven. That's so Jesus. And that moment is when he's on the cross and there's two thieves. Remind me about that word, thief. And one of them is deriding Jesus, get down from the cross, save yourself. And the other one says, we deserve what we're getting. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And in that moment, Jesus says, all he has to say, today you'll be with me in paradise. And always a chance for forgiveness. And that's the theological Jesus. It, of course, for Christians, certainly for Episcopalians, and I would say, if we were really comparing Catholicism, Roman Catholicism to the Episcopal Church, where we kind of deviate it's subtle, trust me, but we tend to emphasize Easter more than we do Good Friday. If you think about it, I point this out to the children all the time here. The cross is empty in Episcopal churches for the most part, unless it's a super high Anglo-Catholic church. And the crosses in Catholic churches always have Jesus on the cross suffering or dying, right?
That's how you can tell the difference, right?
That's usually how you can tell the difference, yeah. It's really more a Protestant thing than it is Episcopal, but it's, but we're Episcopal, so I can only speak from this tradition. So often we're thinking of Easter in terms of the cross is empty, just as the tomb is empty. He's risen, but he's also transformed a symbol of torture, just talking about how it's a tortured subject, transforming it into a symbol of hope that we all wear around our necks, right? And we ward off vampires with them. Unconditional love is embodied in that sacrifice, that he would go to this great a length in order to redeem humans and restore a relationship with God. And it never, of course, answers all our questions. Even with all of this tradition that I've just laid out about Jesus, there's still some questions to remain. Why does that have to be the act of unconditional love? Why does he have to die? Who needs that death, and why does it have to be Jesus? And we're talking about theology, the big picture. So is it a ransom? And if so, are we paying a ransom to God? So God ordered Jesus' death? I'm doing this just to invite you into how complicated it can get really quickly. What were you going to say, Sarah?
Even in literature, you have to have hero death. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. We
it's
see
not
it now.
Logical, it's just like a good story.
Exactly. Is it punishment? All of these things. It does, however, give us an example of how important love is to God. If you remember,
How?
3 weeks ago, how exactly? Complicated.
You can't say that and not say how.
How? Exactly. Do you remember how I said, part of the point of the universe or creation is this is God sharing with us and showing us what love is like. It's an example of Jesus unconditionally loving God and loving humanity going through the torture. That's the example. You're right. What you're thinking of, Chris, is absolutely correct too, which is how is that, look at it from God's point of view, because it does not look like love. It looks like Sophie's Choice, right? And in Sophie's Choice, she didn't want to have to make a choice, right? Okay, sorry, great movie, by the way. And the tradition finally says that in Jesus's resurrection, in the belief and the acceptance that Jesus was bodily resurrected, literally got up physically, walked on the earth, had wounds in his hands, all of those things, and then ascended, took his body with him, that we can all be spiritually resurrected, that death doesn't have the last say, and that there's a hope for all of us. Now, hold on to all of that, including the questions of how on earth can we say God is loving out of that.
I think we need like a 6-day.
We sure do, you're right. But we have to keep moving.
No.
No, I know. Stop. No, we'll come back. All right, so that's the one account. I wish there was like 2 of me here. I wish that a lot. Okay, so this is now who was Jesus. Let's switch to the history. This is a stone tablet they found. This is just really for illustration. It's one of these things that gets uncovered in excavations in the Holy Land or Palestine. And they say, wow, that's yet another thing that underscores that some of the stuff in the Bible was actually accurate. For example, I know you can't translate it, but it's called the Pilate stone, and it has something to do with Pontius Pilate. So it affirms that Pontius Pilate was existing and that the chronology is correct in the Gospels, that there was a Roman procurator in Judea who executed Jesus. And it's the pieces that are missing, they have corroborated in other writings. It's a little bit like Indiana Jones, isn't it? I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. But they basically go, all that stuff about Pontius Pilate is right, and kind of underscores why it's in our creed, why it's so specific, because we do mention Pontius Pilate by name, because that locates Jesus in actual history for us, to go to look at the timeline of Roman rulers and how it worked then. Some of you may have heard of this book. It's about 10 years old now. It's called Zealot by Reza Aslan, who is, I think, a practicing Muslim. And zealot is the great word, but he also spends a lot of time talking about the word bandit. And when I was talking about the thieves earlier, the word for thieves in Greek, because this was the language then, certainly language in the New Testament, is lestai. The other word for thief is kleptai. It's where we get kleptomaniac from. So kleptai means a thief, but that scripture passage from Luke that I was talking about uses the word lestai, which means a bandit. What's a bandit? Well, it sounds like a thief, but in terms of the first century, according to Roman rule, a bandit was somebody that was an insurrectionist who was causing division in the public forum and was going to incite an insurrection over the emperor Caesar. So when you label somebody a bandit, that's the worst possible thing you can give to them. Barabbas is a bandit, exactly, and a zealot. Yes, so the historical Jesus that Reza Aslan is getting to, and it's actually a really good book. He doesn't throw away the tradition or the faith in Jesus. He just says what we do know historically of Jesus is enough to think he was one of the most important people that ever walked the face of the earth. In the first century, the very first kind of recorded examples that we have, and some of it's in the writings of Paul and all too, is that people were, at about 2 or 3 decades after the death of Jesus on the cross, executed by Rome as a bandit, that people were gathering in homes in Cape, this was all like cavernous back then. They would go to homes of a wealthy person or benefactor in town, and they called themselves the Way. They weren't at the point where they called themselves Christian yet. They were the people of the Way. And they were gathering in secrecy because Rome was in charge and you had to be pagan or Jewish. And these were former Jewish people now worshiping Jesus of Nazareth as their Messiah, which is heresy if you're Jewish, what they're doing. That's why the secrecy. And it could get you in trouble with Rome and you could get executed just like Jesus. So that's why it was all in secret. And they were doing Eucharist and they were baptizing. They were doing all these things. They were talking about God in 3 forms, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And this is another place now, a modern picture of kind of mimicking what the dwellings would have been like in there. It's a little bit nicer than it probably was. But nowadays these places are upwards to 2,000 years old, and now they just turn them into churches instead of building on top of them. Thanks be to God. So the historical Jesus is a quest to find out what can we know about the actual Jesus who actually lived. So it actually was a quest that was embarked on in the 1900s. This kind of has to do with what we talked about the Enlightenment in the 1600s and 1700s. In the 1800s, that's still going. Think about all the scientific advancements. By the end of the century, medicine, for example, we had not vaccines. Did we have vaccines then? No, we had X-rays, right? And pasteurization, I think. The quest for the historical Jesus wants to know some things like this picture, which has made the rounds in the last 20 years, which is an artist's illustration of the Shroud of Turin, which was that black and white image in the previous thing. And they took it and put it in a computer and basically looked accurately at what a first century Palestinian Jew would have probably looked like. They would have worked in the sun, so their skin would have been darker. It already would have been an olive complexion anyway. He probably would have carried a beard that's a little bit got more curly hair and probably messier on top, not that straight brown Anglo hair. So that's I guess it was the 18th century too. That's this first quest to try to figure out what can we learn about the historical Jesus. And that is when the Shroud of Turin popped up. That's when everybody was bringing that out and getting the Pope to bless it. And they would shuffle it around and show it. And this was our example that Jesus really lived until they started doing some diagnostics on it. Albert Schweitzer and crew came up with a second quest for Jesus using more modern tools at the time, and that was in the 60s and 70s. So it's not so much archaeology as it is trying to layer in what we actually know about the history from archaeology or anthropology, and then going what likely is accurate from the Gospels and Scripture about Jesus and what is not. And they would literally just kind of throw out what's not usable there. Some of the other authors and writers that came out of this period might be some you've seen books by. John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg is kind of a descendant of this school of thought. He's written a lot. And this is all within the last 30, 40, 50 years. And then they did the Jesus Seminar where they did walk through and do all that work I'm talking about, where they basically threw out everything about Jesus that was impossible to have actually happened. And what they're left with is very few things, that there was a 30-year-old Jewish man who caused an uprising and had a following, and they executed him. And Pontius Pilate was the procurator governor at the time. And then from that point on, that's where you leave Jesus. And then you're talking about the history of Christianity, which is how people pick up that quest and start worshiping. But that's not what the Jesus Seminar was focused on. So the final quest that they did was the 1980s. This is one of the things that is a great visual example for visual learners of what we're talking about with the historical Jesus, when you're throwing out tradition and just trying to figure out what can we actually measure, what can we actually verify, and what do we know given the new science and the new tools that we have. What they started to figure out, and I'm not saying this is part of the Jesus Seminar, but this is part of the spirit of the last 2 centuries of study, is that, wow, we've got 4 Gospels. Let's put John aside because John is the strangest thing anybody's ever read. And we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew is, we love Matthew. The church has always loved Matthew. It's a really good book, it's pretty solid. And then we've got Mark, and my goodness, Mark sounds a lot like Matthew sometimes. And then they started to look in with almost, with a microscope and say, actually, these are the exact same words. Somebody copied the other person. Then they noticed the same thing happened with Luke. Then they noticed that there was a whole other source which is lost to history that we don't know. Maybe it was many sources, probably more likely, but we need to give it a name. So we give it the name Quell, which I think is French for hidden or mystery, and we call it Q for short. So there's this Q out there. I'm trying to read the faces to see if I've lost people entirely.
There's another gospel?
It's not a gospel, it's a collection of sayings or stories about Jesus that don't appear in Mark, but both appear in Matthew and Luke.
Tell me that this is not the source of that QAnon has bastardized.
No, not completely different. I don't know if that idea of using Q was some kind of thing comes from that or comes from Star Trek, because there's a character named Q as well.
Are you saying these are stories that have been found on the?
Some of them have been, some things have been found, not Q sources though. But there are stuff that didn't make it into Gospels. That is probably part of Q that we'll never know. There's material though in Luke and Matthew that is identical to Mark, word for word in the Greek. And then there's material in Matthew and Luke that is identical only to the 2 of them. Therefore, the 2 of them had access to a third source, whatever that, or sources more likely. Makes sense?
So the word kel.
Yeah.
Well, kel in French means what?
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
What? Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Did I
What?
say right, Cal?
Q-U-E-L-L.
It means what?
Q-U-L, yeah, exactly.
It means what?
Which is what you're all, the face, look on all your faces
What?
right now, right?
What?
All you need to know is that this is the kind of stuff that historical Jesus people, this is catnip for them.
But it's also like,
Yeah.
like somebody who studies language, they don't even have to be religious.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're not necessarily looking for a deep meaning, they're literally looking at the text.
Exactly, right.
They're just analyzing.
Let's look at an example.
Yes, it's like when you split a sentence up.
Yeah,
that's
it's
all
like,
they're doing, but they're
you
like,
see how
"Oh,
this is not-
This is the same as this sentence, and so they came from the same source, we don't know what that source is.
right. This is the same process of like looking under a microscope at an organism, which wasn't happening in a structured way with the best tools of the 19th and 20th century until you get to that point, right? And same kind of story here with language, with
I
genre,
have a
with literature.
question,
Yeah,
because I was looking at the direction of the arrows.
yes,
So have they determined that Mark was before? the
Yeah.
Matthew?
go, yes, thank you, good
Is
question.
that older? or
Good
something?
question. That leads us to go, Mark is the earliest one written. We don't know exactly when it was written, but it was probably written between 65 and 70 AD.
Well, isn't it shorter gospels? too?
Shorter, yeah, it's
So
only
Mark
16
and
chapters.
Matthew and Luke are more embellished and have
Exactly.
more.
Exactly. I'm going to show you an example of that. So here's how all 4 begin. We'll put John back in the mix. But John is unequivocally its own thing from a whole nother tradition altogether. And you may be asking, what are we talking about with these traditions? Well, that's exactly it. By the end of the 1st century, there are communities of early Christians, and those communities have their own ideas about Jesus. Grayson Lennox thinks Jesus was a great gardener and had great sermons and all that, and St. John's Lockport thinks Jesus was a rabble rouser and a king in the making or something. You see what I'm saying? They all have different things. In this case, if Mark is the first one written, this is how his gospel begins, right? And I say his euphemistically, it's probably a they. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And then John the Baptist comes. And then we go right to Jesus' baptism. Without, I mean, you probably already looked at these. What's missing from this? His birth. Yeah, Mary, Joseph. It's kind of wild if you think about it. The whole gospel doesn't even talk about where he came from or anything. It doesn't talk about his 12-year-old experience either.
So it just talks about as he begins his ministry.
This is it. It starts with his ministry. Yeah, that's all there was to it. Now you're tempted then to go, Mark's the earliest one, so it must be the most accurate one. But we don't know. I mean, we really don't know if that's the case. And that's not necessarily the right thing to assume, that the oldest thing is the most correct thing. In fact, some people think it's actually the reverse. Matthew begins with a genealogy. In an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Jacob, et cetera, et cetera. And then it finally catches up with a genealogy all the way down from Mary to Jesus. So I forget who was saying it, but somebody was asking about King David.
Yeah, that was me.
That was you, yeah. So Matthew is a gospel that is really concerned with that and wants to point out that Jesus has a lineage that is incredibly critical to the history of, biblical mankind. Luke's gospel says, is more like a letter, since I've basically taken all this time to write an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among you. I decided after investigating everything carefully from the very first to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, which is a word, if you translate it into English, means God lover or lover of God. So this Theophilus could be made up. It could be just the reader. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron. And then Luke gets into the game with doing his genealogy as well. Finally, you have John, which is completely different. And instead of retelling the birth narrative, John talks about a different birth narrative, the beginning of all time, creation. So in this account, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. I think of it like those pictures when, like, the president and Saudi Arabian like kings, they always get together and they have their hands on like a bright orb. You've seen that picture? I think it was Donald Trump, but it's just like, what are they doing? But I always like, that's actually not a bad image of, don't take that out of context. God and Jesus kind of looking down on the globe or all of creation, and God saying, I'm going to deploy you into action. You're going to go down on earth and fulfill this prophet. That's kind of where, without this, we have trouble talking about God as a Trinity, and that God operates as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and that they have some kind of division of labor,
It's also like some kind of leading into.
Yes.
There's Genesis and it doesn't have Jesus, so let's add it.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. No, you're right. John
Yeah.
1 echoes Genesis quite intentionally. Yeah.
How do they know that Mark is the oldest? Who determined that? And
Well,
when
it's
did
kind of
they
like
figure this
deduction.
out?
It's not, nobody knows 100%, but they're deducing that various other things. I can't list them all, but I'm things like Matthew's might refer to a specific event that happened after a certain date in history, or Luke may be referencing something that Mark doesn't reference, and it somehow places them in like dating. Let me try to give you a better example. It's like if a book was written in 1950, the book was written in 1980. One of the books talks about a DeLorean. It's going to be the 1980 one, not the 1950 one.
So it's,
See what I mean?
it's based. It's
So
not
it's a
based
game of
on-
deduction.
They go
it's
like
not the base.
word by word. Like,
Right.
It's not anything that normal people would ever.
Yeah.
Like like my brother does it from he's a medievalist.
Yes.
So like that's kind of his job, is to figure out. And they can even, this sounds crazy, but they can even like carbon date, like.
It's not crazy,
the
it's
high.
awesome.
Well, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
Was it based on
Yeah.
the words, the language, or was it
Yes.
based on
Yeah,
the
and-
physicality?
And what they know of, the history of the world and
Yeah, it's
things like
not,
that.
it's like, it's not, this is, like, what he's talking about is years.
Oh, yeah, centuries.
Oh, yeah.
centuries.
I mean,
So
We could never do, we just have to believe.
let me give you another quick example, because we're almost at
That's
8.
always my answer.
That's how I do.
Eschatology is a fun word if you want to impress people at parties at Christmas. It means study of the end of the world, okay? So the part of theology that's all about what's God doing with this talk about second coming and end times and all that, what's that all about? That's another class for another time too. Chris, that's another 6-part class just on
I only
eschatology.
have so many years.
I know. So Mark 8 that has this passage, this is one of my favorite examples of what we're talking about. Jesus, now that's not almost word for word, not quite. Jesus called the disciples and said, if anyone would become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. The comparable passage from Matthew, if anyone want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me, word for word. Obviously it's English, but word for word.
yeah.
Then you go to this one, and it's Luke, and goodness gracious, it's right about there, word for word, except for one word. Which word? There's one different word in that sentence. Can you read it from there? Daily. Daily, exactly. So what's happening right here? The word daily comes in. If anyone want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. Well, here's another example, Chloe, of how we can guess some educated
No,
guess.
I just wanted to know if it was being based on the language of it.
No, it's
or is it
all
was it
kinds.
physical, like she was talking about the carbon?
You're right, absolutely. But
Yeah.
then they will use these kind of context clues, which is, remember I said Mark was written probably 65 to 70 AD. I'm sorry, I don't have a timeline for you. But what happened in 70 AD was the Emperor Nero came in and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed their temple. And then plunged them into years of oppressive rule by Nero and Caligula and those guys. Then when Nero did that, that would have been, I used to use the example of 9/11. But more that day of 9/11 feeling when you're like, what more is there? Where do we go from here? All of that. And again, with no internet or nightly news to tell them, give them context of what was happening when the temple was destroyed, they knew that the only place in their tradition where they could access God was that second temple in Jerusalem. That's the whole reason we have pilgrimages. You go to Jerusalem, you get to that one holy spot where you can encounter God. And darn if Rome didn't just burn it to the ground. Therefore, this is the end of the world that Jesus was talking about. So when you start saying that, then you look at Mark's gospel again, going, okay, let me put on the glasses that says it's the end of the world as we know it. And then you read Mark and you go, oh, it's all over the place. Immediately, they got up and left. Immediately, Jesus took them in front of the Sanhedrin. Immediately, and the word immediately comes up, the English word immediately is in there like 40 times in a short gospel. And you see there's an urgency to it all. You have to, when Mark is talking and having Jesus say, and careful with my words, when Mark has Jesus say, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Mark is envisioning all of them are going to die on the cross just like Jesus. And that this is the big battle between good and evil
Pretty
we've been
soon.
waiting for. Yeah, in our lifetime.
Yes.
When you get to Matthew, which they think comes about 2 decades later, that urgency is gone, except for this passage is still basically intact. But a lot of that urgency is gone in Matthew's gospel throughout. The word immediately does not appear in Matthew nowhere near as frequently as in Mark, for example. And then when you get to Luke, which might be another decade later, which is probably as much as 30 years after this gospel is written, which it is quoting word for word. So the guy had Mark next to him and copied words on purpose. But he changed this one and added daily because they knew at this point the second coming was not happening in their lifetime. And you can either be crushed by that, or you can say, perhaps Jesus was talking in something like a metaphor, and that we're not actually supposed to die a bloody death for our faith. And in fact, taking up their cross means something on multiple levels, that it does literally put a cross on your back and go get crucified. you see how the theology has changed? It's really with one word. That's why it's such a great example of why I'm actually defending why these gospels, we're not going to throw them out because they're plagiarists. That's a modern thing. This was an act of honor to take up a writing and add to it instead of throwing it out. Back then. We'll see more of that with Paul when people pretend they're Paul writing a letter. So again, who is Jesus? We've got the Sunday school Jesus who loves little children. We've got the historical Jesus. And then we've got the Jesus of tradition, which has him as a bandit. Here he is cleansing the temple or causing a ruckus in the temple to make some bigger points. And that would be probably, we file that under teacher, role model, maybe role model, rebel, exactly. So here's a thought exercise to sum up what I'm trying to say, and then we're gonna talk in groups. There's this guy I knew, Will, and Will died at age 23, when I was also 23, died in a car accident in Richmond, Virginia. And Will, thank you. So 23 is a little hard, right? He was born in 1979, same year as I was. He went to the same church that I did, All Saints, Richmond. We did some mission trips together. He was, I went off to college, I moved away. Will lived in Richmond, Virginia. And then one day he missed a turn and hit a tree and died. And then that's Will. That's the historical account. Let me tell you the account that I know about Will. He was funny. He was such a good friend. I miss him daily. I'm stronger, closer with his parents now. I took on attributes that he did, like the way I tell jokes and the way I laugh. You know what I mean? He wanted to be a writer. He was a really good writer. You see what I'm doing here? You see how you can have both and they can both be true. And it can sometimes be dangerous if you exclude one or the other, right? All right, now. Oh, there was a picture of us too. There you go. Real story. Which parts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection do you find hard to believe? And does it help you or hinder you to know more about the historical Jesus? And consider that you might want some pumpkin cake as you talk about this in your small groups. And David and Leslie, you can just basically stay muted and talk amongst yourselves or reflect, if that's okay. And we'll come back in about 20 minutes and wrap up.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Just need one chair. I had to stand up. These chairs. Oh, I've got a cushion in there for my sewing and I should really get it out. Because we need her to sew, I need it. I just leave it in the closet and I definitely, oh, I moved over.
Oh.
That's okay.
Good dinner.
It was delicious. They're all my favorites.
We're just got a couple minutes, David and Leslie. That's all I was saying. It looked like, I know it just looked like I was talking, but I wasn't.
No, it's fine. We're ready when you are. Finally got her to agree with me.
Sometimes I just don't know what I believe.
Where's it coming from?
Who was it that went through and became the red letter? The Q that went through and like, said these are the only words that Jesus wrote, or that Jesus said?
No,
That's something-
that happened in the Jesus seminar. It wasn't, it was the guys in the 70s and 80s did some of that. Like literally underlining,
Well, I mean, you can buy a Bible that's red, if it's red.
right.
Yeah.
And they, if I'm not mistaken, what they would do is only the things that two or more gospels agree on.
Yes, so they can like prove it, he said.
Yeah, so something like the story I was telling you from the cross with the two thieves, it's only in one gospel, so it comes out. Like they had a little scoring system for what they thought was verifiable. But even then, you know, now we know those gospel writers weren't trying to make a genre of history. It was a new genre that's kind of like a biography. And more like a biopic, a movie, when it takes someone's life and kind of like
Montage.
adds things to it, you know? Yeah, exactly. Some take a lot of liberties, like I would say John's gospel. Others take less liberties. Okay, what profound thoughts or pushback or feelings, solutions? What have you got? Anybody want to say? I heard good things. Trying not to pay attention.
Well,
but
we basically said that we probably don't really believe it, that it also makes not one bit of difference to our faith and how we lead our life if Mary was a virgin.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I thought you meant when you said it, like everything. I was like, whoa,
Well,
hold on.
no, the fact
Whoa.
that,
I
like,
lost you.
some churches spend a long time
The
like,
virgin birth.
really
Yes.
into the Virgin Mary is not really
Right.
important to me, and I don't really believe it.
Right.
And it doesn't matter.
Let alone the fact that a ton of contemporaries, and Reza Aslan said that Jesus is not even the most popular of the kind of bandit zealot that he was. You know, according to Rome, and we're not saying we think he was a bandit or zealot, but according to Rome, he wasn't even the most popular or the one that had the biggest following. And you have all of these other civilizations, the most famous one being Rome, which also has a legend about a virgin birth for Julius Caesar. So you can kind of see how sometimes these things just kind of creep in through osmosis of just like this. If we want our hero to be the most, somebody was using the term about hero, like you need good and evil. I think that was you, Sarah. Why not? We got to add in all the classics, right? He's got a virgin birth. He dies young.
He's adopted just like Superman.
He's adopted just like Superman, right?
Yeah.
Superman did come later, but semantics, yeah.
But you know,
Does a virgin birth like would that have been a sign of divinity of some sort,
Yes,
like for
exactly.
Caesar? And
No, I'm sorry, you're right. I didn't finish that thought. That's
Yeah.
right. It's kind of a sign that they are ever like the gods of all these other pagan religions of the time, right? That have these spectacular births, or Achilles being, dangled by his heel in the river Styx.
So was Mary like pre-chosen before she was ever conceived because she was supposed to be without sin?
Yeah. So now you're asking a question about
So was
theology.
Was Anne without sin also? I mean, this is all.
Right. So Catholics, you're kind of,
stop.
yeah, or you're pure. Yeah, you can keep going that way, right? But yeah,
Right, so-
Anne and her husband.
How do you get into this family that's
They're
like
barely in the
no
Bible.
sin from the
So
beginning of
Mary's
time?
mother Anne was retrofitted after the Bible was done with a whole nother backstory that said she too gave birth as a virgin to Mary. And that's the Immaculate Conception. That's-
I'd never heard that
The
one.
Immaculate
I know what
Conception
you're
is Mary's story, not.
Now you
ours.
really-
Ours is-
Twice
Apparently only Barb was
removed.
listening to catechesis.
Two
There.
virgin births.
So Jesus was like doubly virgin birth though,
He's
because
he was as
where's
blessed
the
and
mother and with God the Father? I
Exactly,
mean,
as
he's
blessed
like-
and defined as they could make it to underscore his importance, right? But what I like too, what you all are saying, which is not what I first thought you were saying, which is, I don't believe in anything, but, but instead, you're saying that those details, like the virgin birth, don't necessarily matter in terms of what you believe and your faith and how you go about your faith.
Well,
Exactly, yeah.
I also think that back in the 12th century, when Constantine stuck his finger into all of this, and he's bringing his Roman gods into all this
Right.
too, you know, I think they chose and they picked and choose, and, you know,
Yeah.
that the religion became something other than what it was originally supposed to be, right?
Right, oh, sure, yeah.
They threw out a lot of stuff that we don't even know what was there anymore.
Take it a step further, but this comes up a lot, and this is almost like a bumper sticker at this point, but do you think Jesus envisioned all of the trappings of religion as his grand plan for all of us? No, because, and it's kind of embarrassing if you do think that, and then you read the actual gospels and we know what he would be doing right now, you know?
Right.
He'd have the doors open 24/7 and have beggars and everybody come through.
Well, and again, nobody
Yeah.
believed him. I mean, Joel Osteen would kick him out
Right.
of his church. He'd
He also
say, "Who
wouldn't
are
stay
you?
here very
You're a
long."
You're a peasant, get out of here.
Exactly. What other thoughts? This is good stuff. Yeah, David or Leslie, would you like to say something? David's like, where do I begin?
Are they muted?
You're muted. I think isn't it the mute?
I think they're
probably
looking for it. Don't worry, we're waiting for you.
They're unmuted.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the key issue for me in terms of beliefs is the incarnation. And it kind of hinges on that, whether you believe that God was incarnate and came into the world. And it's a difficult belief, but that's where all the rest kind of key on that. If you can accept the concept of the incarnation and the other things, you can look at as a one-off, a one-time thing. That's something we never have experienced and will never experience. But that seems to be the key issue for me, the incarnation, that God himself became man. And then that's the main thing I had to say about this. It kind of all that just seems the central issue to me. And then as far as the historical Jesus, I think that's a mixed bag, for me, because I think of a lot of the determination of who the historical Jesus is a very subjective, and they use, critical thinking, they use consensus, but the emphasis on Jesus as a zealot, I see where it comes from, and I think that's why he was executed. But I think Jesus was quite distinct from the other zealots because he wasn't trying to seize political power. He wasn't trying to use the same methods. He wasn't, so those were my feelings. Anyway.
Well said. The camera is in love with me for some reason, but everyone was nodding while you were talking. Just want you to know. Yeah. As I was drinking water. Yeah. Any other thoughts, anybody?
Maybe knowing a lot more about the historical Jesus would take away from what he was trying to teach everybody. So maybe that's why it's always kind of shrouded in mystery about who he really was.
Maybe, yeah. And you can't underestimate too that influence of the Enlightenment, which we felt for now the better part of 500 years, where we need proof. And now we have the ability to find proof for everything except some of this stuff. We can't prove it. We can't find the answers. And maybe we weren't meant to, or maybe they're there and they got covered up by a Byzantine church.
Or maybe they're just not being given to us yet.
Or maybe they're not being given to us yet. Yeah, that was the only thing I was gonna say to David. I was like, David, you sounded pretty certain that nothing like Jesus would happen again. And I don't know, maybe it's something, maybe in a different way. Could Jesus come back, in the form of a child with Down syndrome? You know what I mean? And I'm not speaking either. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I wasn't, that was just something I threw in. I don't know what God's going to do in the future. I'm not certain he can't, send. But Yeah, I was just gonna say, you were talking about the Enlightenment, and it has had an effect on us. Modernity, the whole, we can improve because we can achieve, we can know more and we can come to absolute truth. But we're past that now. We're no longer part of the children of the Enlightenment. We've come to the point where we no longer believe that to be true. We don't necessarily believe we can achieve true knowledge just by knowing more. I think things like the Holocaust and the nuclear blasts and things like that have taught us that just because we know more doesn't mean that we are able to achieve absolute truth.
Beautifully said, and I would throw even COVID-19 into that. Not that it's as devastating a tragedy as those, but getting there. Yeah, this is great. Any other thoughts, anybody, or questions? Ooh, this is good. Lots to chew on. And yeah,
The only, I agree kind of with David about incarnate,
yes,
but it doesn't change like my faith system. I still believe in the teachings of Jesus, and I still
Right.
believe that that's the way I'd like to live my life, but it's something that I'm not sure really happened, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I still.
Well, that's me in the Trinity,
yeah. Right.
because I don't believe in the Trinity.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe there's three. I don't believe it's one.
Right.
And over in the Bible, they keep separating.
Yeah, you're what's called a modalist. We'll talk about that in 3 weeks. Yeah. It's okay. Modalist, there's many modalists. They used to get put to death. Don't worry, I'm a closet modalist.
I was gonna say,
Yes, it's a great thought, and
I keep waiting
the
to
problem is
read a
there's evidence for that.
passage.
Yeah,
that will tell me that he is,
Right.
and the passages don't.
Yeah.
They separate it out.
exactly.
So it's kind of hard to think of a person being one, when you're talking about a father and then a son, and how can it can't be one.
They can't be, but then also you
But
got
they
Luke.
are.
You got Luke's gospel, and Jesus says, "Father, forgive them; they know not what they do." Who's he talking to?
That's what,
You know, and then also says, "Remove this cup from my
Right,
lips."
but
In two
then
gospels.
that separates them right there.
Right.
There can't be
Yeah.
one. It can't be one.
It can't be
same.
one. Yeah.
But don't we refer to God as our magic?
Yeah, so where did right. Catholic Church.
This feels like the perfect cliffhanger for like a TV show. Adults trying to
hey,
figure
they
out
were getting
Jesus.
together, they were arguing about it,
Yeah.
and one side was,
That was-
all right, we'll give you this, you give me a sack of
Well,
potatoes.
and it's also, exactly, and basically what's fun
Yeah.
about this is, I think we're kind of coalescing around the idea. You need a little bit of historical, and you need a little bit of together, and they're classical in the tradition, and they both matter in some way. But then ultimately, I heard people talk about the word mystery, or it's a matter of faith. Yeah, there's a lot of gaps that we don't know, and we have to fill those gaps ourselves in community, in conversation, weighing things like scripture and the experience of what we see in the world, and whether it's imbalances of justice and whatnot. Ooh, so that's it. I think we just didn't solve anything. We just opened all the world's problems. There you go. And thank you all for a great discussion. We'll see you next week. And Carol, you've got dinner.
Oh,
Sure.
Well,
We're missing 2.
so there's
Missing 3.
3, so there's.
No, it could be 13.
Do I provide a beer as well?
No, that's just here. Thank you guys at home. Bye-bye. Great to have you.
thanks, Greg, you are fabulous.
Oh, thank
This
you.
is so good.